Megan Walker stepped into the Grand Archery Club, a place where the polished floors gleamed under the bright lights and the air hummed with the sound of arrows flying effortlessly toward their targets. The members of this exclusive club were dressed in finely tailored suits and designer gear, their faces confident and sure. It felt like an arena of wealth and privilege, a world where Megan, with her simple clothes and worn-out bow, was an outsider. Her worn leather bag, once used for training in the quiet woods of her home, seemed out of place among the sleek, custom-made equipment around her. The receptionist barely glanced at her, then looked her up and down, her lips curling into a polite but dismissive smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice dripping with disinterest. Megan swallowed the lump in her throat but refused to let herself be intimidated. "I'd like to register for today's open session." The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "We're a members-only club. Do you have a membership card?" "I have a day pass," Megan replied quietly, pulling the crinkled envelope from her bag. It was a gift from an old friend, a former colleague of her late husband, Nathan. The receptionist took the envelope, glanced at it, and handed it back with a sigh, clearly uninterested in her presence. Megan stood tall, her fingers tightening around the familiar weight of the bow in her hands. She was used to being overlooked, to walking through life unnoticed. But today, something inside her stirred. She wasn't here to be invisible. She was here to practice, to prove something not just to this club, but to herself. With a deep breath, Megan moved toward the practice range, her heart racing with determination. Megan adjusted the strap of her bow case and moved toward the far end of the range, away from the elite shooters clustered at the other end. They were too busy talking, showing off their custom gear, to notice her. She found a spot at one of the basic lanes, set her bag down, and opened it with careful hands, revealing her old, reliable bow. It wasn't much, no fancy engravings or the sleek, high-tech designs of the other equipment around her, but it was hers. It had been with her through everything. As Megan pulled out her arrows, a voice interrupted the quiet hum of the room. It was loud, drawing attention, unmistakably smug. Well, Blake Hawthorne said, his voice dripping with condescension. He sauntered over, flanked by a group of his friends, all dressed in expensive shooting gear. His bow, a piece of pure craftsmanship, was slung casually across his back. "Looks like someone took a wrong turn on the way to Walmart," he added, his laughter echoing through the room. Megan's eyes flicked up briefly from her bow as she registered the sneer in Blake's tone, but she didn't respond. She kept her movement slow and deliberate as she positioned herself. The group behind Blake laughed, clearly amused by his little joke, not caring that the joke was at someone else's expense. Blake, one of the most decorated archers in the country, had never been used to losing, never had to deal with anyone who dared to challenge him, let alone someone who didn't even belong in his world. He continued, oblivious to her silence. "What's the deal here? You must have wandered in from the wrong side of town, sweetheart. This isn't some backyard competition." His eyes scanned her simple clothes, her old, unpolished equipment, and then landed on the bow in her hand. "Tell you what, let's make this interesting." Megan didn't respond immediately. Instead, she pulled her string back, focused on her target. The soft whoosh of the arrow slicing through the air was drowned out by Blake's voice, now louder, as he spoke to his friends. "I'll bet 10 grand that she can't even hit the target," Blake said, his smirk widening as he glanced at his companions, who laughed in unison, the sound grating in Megan's ears. Megan didn't flinch. She was used to this, being underestimated, being judged by appearances. But there was something in Blake's challenge that flickered inside her, a reminder of who she used to be, a woman who had once taken on challenges like this without a second thought. She remembered Nathan's words, his quiet belief in her, his trust in her abilities. He'd always known she had the skill, even when she didn't. Her hand tightened around the bow. She could feel the weight of it, the familiar tension in her arm, the way the string pulled her focus into a tight circle of concentration. The laughter faded into the background as she took a breath, exhaled, and released the arrow. It flew true, hitting the target dead center. The group fell silent for a moment. Blake, momentarily stunned, glanced at the target, then back at Megan. His face twisted in disbelief, then frustration. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Megan remained still, her expression unchanged. Her bow, though ordinary, felt as natural as it ever had. She knew this game well. Blake scoffed, stepping forward. He couldn't let this stand. He had a reputation to protect. "All right then," he said, his voice rising with a new challenge. "If you're so confident, how about this? I'll make it interesting." He turned to his friends. $10,000 says you can't hit the bullseye from 50 yards. Megan's fingers tightened on the bowstring. She glanced at him, her eyes calm but steady, the faintest hint of determination flickering behind her gaze. "I don't have that kind of money," she replied, her voice low but unwavering. Her words cut through the arrogance in Blake's eyes like a sharp arrow. Blake's expression darkened. His smirk turned into a full-on grin. Well, if by some miracle you hit the bullseye again, I'll pay. If not, you leave and never come back. Deal? Megan considered him for a moment. She knew she should walk away, knew this was ridiculous, but something in Blake's tone, something in the way he dismissed her, made her feel something rise within her, a quiet rebellion, a desire to prove not just him wrong, but herself too. She glanced at Rebecca Johnson, the club manager, who had quietly approached, watching the exchange with a furrowed brow. Rebecca opened her mouth to intervene, but Blake waved her off with a dismissive flick of his hand. This is just a little fun, Rebecca. Let's see if the lady can back up her shot. Megan nodded once, her face a mask of calm. I'll take your challenge, she said softly. But if I win, the money goes to the Veterans Support Foundation. Blake raised an eyebrow but didn't protest. His arrogance told him it was a risk he'd win. The crowd had begun to gather, a small circle of onlookers forming around the two of them. Rebecca, who had been quietly observing, glanced at Megan, her concern evident. Maybe this isn't the best idea, she said softly, her tone edged with caution. Blake's been known to play dirty in his challenges. He has a lot to lose. Megan gave her a small, appreciative nod, but the look in her eyes was firm. I'm not worried about him, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. With that, Megan took her stance, ignoring the growing tension around her. She had a promise to keep, and no one, least of all Blake, could take that from her. As Megan steadied herself at the firing line, the crowd behind her buzzed with anticipation. Blake, standing at the side, wore a smirk that screamed confidence, but it was the kind of confidence that often bloomed out of arrogance, not knowledge. Megan could feel his eyes on her, but she wasn't going to let that shake her. She had made a promise to herself and to Nathan. She could still see him in her mind's eye, the way his steady hand had guided hers the first time she pulled a bowstring. The way his voice had calmed her nerves when she doubted herself, when the world seemed too heavy. Remember what I taught you, Nathan had said. His lessons had started out as a means to keep her safe. If I'm going to be away so much, I want you to know how to defend yourself. But over time it had become something more, a way for them to bond, to share a space where they didn't need words. Just the sound of arrows flying and the quiet hum of a shared purpose. As she set the arrow on the string, Megan's mind wandered back to those days. She could still feel the warmth of Nathan's hands adjusting her stance, the firmness of his grip guiding her fingers, making sure her hold was just right. He had always been patient, showing her the calm behind the storm. The lessons had been about control of the bow, yes, but more importantly, of herself. It was after his funeral that Megan had packed up their things, moving to a quieter life in Boston. The archery gear, locked away in a dusty corner, had sat unused for months. Grief had consumed her, leaving her hollow, unable to find the will to shoot again. But now, with the weight of Blake's challenge hanging in the air like an invisible force, Megan felt the stirrings of something deeper inside her, a need to honor Nathan's memory, to remind herself that she wasn't just a widow. She was a woman capable of far more than simply surviving. She drew the string back, feeling the familiar tension in her muscles. The weight of the bow in her hands was a reminder of Nathan's presence, of everything he had taught her. The crowded room seemed to shrink away, the sound of Blake's mocking laughter fading into the background. The first shot was smooth, a perfect. The arrow sped through the air and landed firmly in the center of the bullseye. Megan didn't flinch, didn't smile. She simply lowered her bow, gave it a casual glance, and waited for Blake's response. His eyes flashed with something between disbelief and frustration. His companions, who had been laughing a moment ago, fell silent. Blake took a step forward, his expression shifting. Beginner's luck, he muttered under his breath, but there was no conviction in his voice. He couldn't accept that a woman who didn't belong in his world had just made a perfect shot. All right, he finally said, a flicker of arrogance still clinging to him. Let's see you do it again, then. Megan didn't respond. She just reached for another arrow, placed it on the string, and looked at her target. There was no thrill in the challenge for her. She wasn't here to prove anything to Blake or to anyone else. This wasn't about competition, it was about reconnecting with herself, with the woman she had been before the weight of loss had nearly broken her. The second shot followed almost without thought, her hand guided by years of muscle memory. The arrow flew true again, hitting the bullseye with precision. This time, the crowd was watching more closely, whispers running through the group as Blake's friends exchanged uncertain glances. A few of them shifted uncomfortably. Blake stepped back, his jaw tightening. All right, this is getting ridiculous. $10,000, you said, right? He seemed to be grasping at his earlier confidence, but there was a thread of doubt running through his voice. He tried to play it off as a joke, but it was clear to everyone watching that he was rattled. Megan reached for her third arrow. There was no showmanship, no flourish. Just quiet determination. She wasn't out to impress anyone. The only person she needed to prove something to was herself. "Let's see what you've got, then," Blake said, his voice louder now, trying to regain control of the situation. "If you're so confident, let's see you hit the bullseye from 50 yards. A hush fell over the room. The air thickened with tension, the eyes of every onlooker now locked on Megan. This wasn't just a challenge anymore, it was a spectacle. But to Megan, it wasn't about the spectators or the stakes. It was about one simple thing, keeping her promise to Nathan. She nodded, her gaze unwavering, and walked back to the line. Her body felt heavy with the weight of the bow, but her heart was steady. This was what Nathan had taught her, to breathe through the pressure, to stay calm no matter the challenge. She placed the arrow on the string, took a deep breath, and let everything else fade away. Blake's laughter from behind her only heightened the tension, but Megan didn't allow it to rattle her. The world shrank to the target in front of her, the feel of the bow in her hands, and the rhythm of her breath. She could almost hear Nathan's voice again, whispering in her ear, "Steady. Breathe. Let the shot come to you." With a deep exhale, she released the string. The arrow flew, its flight smooth and steady. For a moment, everything hung in the air, the path of the arrow, the silence of the room, the heartbeats of the crowd. And then, with a soft thud, it landed dead center of the bullseye. The room fell into stunned silence. Blake's face went pale. His confidence, once so unshakable, had cracked, revealing the raw frustration beneath. The crowd began murmuring, their surprise growing into admiration. Megan stood tall, the bow still in her hand, but her face betrayed no emotion. She had done what she set out to do, honor her promise, and prove to herself that she was still capable of more than she had ever imagined. Blake looked from the target to Megan, his words failing him. For the first time that day, the arrogance that had defined him was nowhere to be found. Megan didn't need to hear his response. She had already won, if not the money, then something far more important, her own peace. Blake stood frozen, staring at the target. Megan's third arrow had landed, just like the first two, perfectly in the bullseye. The hush that had fallen over the room was palpable, broken only by the faint hum of disbelief and murmured astonishment. The crowd, once filled with laughter and mocking glances, now held their breath. They had witnessed something unexpected, something far beyond what they had imagined. Blake's friends shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances, their smirks fading into uncertainty. Blake, however, refused to accept what had just happened. His jaw clenched tightly, the last shred of his pride slipping away with each passing second. His eyes flicked from the target to Megan, and then back again, as though waiting for the arrow to magically disappear, as though he could somehow erase her success. "This is impossible," he muttered under his breath, his voice tight with frustration. His reputation as a champion, the very foundation of his arrogance, was crumbling before his eyes. Megan didn't move. She didn't gloat or celebrate. She just stood there, her bow hanging loosely in her hand, her face as calm as ever. She had known this moment was possible, had trained for it. Yes, but what mattered now wasn't proving herself to Blake or anyone else. What mattered was that she had kept her promise to Nathan. She had stepped back into the world she once knew and reclaimed her confidence. Blake took a step toward her, his eyes narrowing. "You think you've won something, huh?" he sneered. "You think you're better than me?" Megan's gaze never wavered. "No," she said quietly. "I think I've proven that anyone can succeed if they're given the chance to try. Even you." Her words were soft but carried an undeniable weight. Blake scoffed, trying to regain control of the situation. His voice rose, the arrogance seeping back into his tone. All right, let's make this more interesting then." He turned to his friends, a challenge written across his face. $10,000 wasn't enough? Fine. Let's see if you can keep this up. Hit 3 bullseyes in a row at 75 yards. If you do, I'll pay. If you miss just one, you leave and never come back. Deal? The crowd went still again, the air thick with anticipation. Megan felt the pressure of the wager. A part of her wanted to walk away, to escape the circus that Blake had turned this into. But another part of her, the part she'd buried beneath grief and doubt for so long, whispered that she couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything. Megan took a breath, feeling the weight of the bow once more. Her fingers twitched in familiar rhythm, as though Nathan were guiding her hand. She met Blake's gaze and nodded. Deal. The room seemed to hold its breath. The stakes had been raised. And Megan? She wasn't just here to shoot arrows anymore. She was here to show that her resolve was stronger than anything Blake could throw her way. She wasn't just reclaiming a past. She was forging a new future, one shot at a time. The air in the archery range grew thick with tension as Blake's challenge hung in the space between them. The spectators were watching with bated breath, the stakes now higher than ever. $10,000 had turned into 50, and the pressure was mounting on Megan. Blake stood with his arms crossed, watching her, an air of arrogance still hanging around him, though his confidence seemed fragile now. He had never expected someone like Megan to push him so far. A woman with no flashy gear, no expensive bow, and no pedigree, someone who didn't belong in his world, had just made him doubt everything he knew about his superiority. Megan, however, stood unfazed, her eyes fixed on the target. She hadn't come here for the money or to humiliate Blake. She was here to honor the promise she had made to Nathan, to prove to herself that she could still be the woman she had once been, the woman who had stood proudly beside her husband, learning from him, growing with him. And now, standing in front of a crowd, in the spotlight of Blake's cruelty, she felt a sense of resolve she hadn't felt in years. With a nod, Megan turned her focus inward. She closed her eyes for a split second, steadying her breathing. The world around her faded as she centered herself. The crowd, the taunts, the pressure, all of it dissipated into the background. In this moment it was just her, the bow, and the target. The lessons Nathan had taught her came flooding back, one by one: control, focus, precision. Blake wasn't the enemy here. The enemy was the doubt she had carried with her since Nathan's death. She could feel him with her in this moment, as if his hand was guiding hers, steadying her aim. Her fingers wrapped around the bowstring, the wood cool against her palm. She took another breath, her body steadying with it. The tension in her muscles was familiar now, like an old friend. Slowly, she pulled the string back, feeling the familiar resistance. The bow became an extension of herself. She exhaled, letting the breath leave her body as the arrow left the string. The shot flew true, hitting the bullseye with a satisfying thud. The crowd reacted with an audible gasp, their collective disbelief hanging in the air like a charge. Blake's face paled, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to regain his composure. He had expected a fluke, a misfire, but there it was, another perfect shot. Blake's jaw clenched. His pride wouldn't let him back down now, not after this. He could feel the weight of the crowd's attention shifting. They weren't just watching Megan anymore. They were watching him, waiting to see how he would react. But he wasn't going to let her have the last word. Not like this. Megan, her face still neutral, didn't flinch. She knew what was coming. Another shot, another perfect hit, and the pressure would be on Blake. The wager was about more than the money now. It was about proving something deeper, something that Blake had never considered. That people like Megan, ordinary, overlooked, could rise and prove themselves capable of more than anyone ever imagined. Blake's voice broke the silence. "All right, one down. Let's see if you can do it again." He sneered, though it sounded forced. He walked towards her, trying to get closer, trying to throw her off with his words. You know, hitting a target on the first shot is nothing. It's consistency that matters. Megan's gaze never wavered from the target as she picked up another arrow. Her breath was steady, and her heart remained calm. She wasn't bothered by Blake's taunts. They were just noise, meaningless distractions. She didn't care about his words. She cared about the shot. She cared about proving to herself that she was still capable. The second arrow was placed carefully on the string. Megan's hand, once hesitant, now felt sure, firm. With a deep breath, she drew the string back, feeling the familiar weight in her muscles. The moment stretched out, the world seeming to pause around her. Time slowed as she released the string, the arrow soaring toward the target. The audience held its breath as the arrow struck. Bullseye. Again. Megan didn't smile, didn't acknowledge the stunned silence that had settled over the crowd. She simply reached for her third arrow. Blake, however, couldn't hide the frustration anymore. His jaw clenched tighter, and his gaze followed the path of the second arrow as it hit the center of the target, confirming what he had feared. The woman he had ridiculed, the woman he had written off, had just made him look foolish in front of everyone. His friends were quiet now, unsure of what to say. The bet no longer seemed like a joke. This was real, and Megan was on the verge of proving herself. Not just to Blake, but to everyone who had ever been underestimated. But Blake wasn't finished. "Let's see if you can do it again," he said, louder this time, trying to regain some semblance of control. 75 yards. Hit 3 bullseyes in a row and I'll pay up. If you miss just one, well, you leave. Deal? Megan nodded, her eyes still fixed on the target. She didn't need to say anything. Her actions would speak louder than any words ever could. She wasn't walking away. Not yet. Not when she was so close to proving everything she had wanted to prove. And with that, she stepped back into position, ready for the final challenge. The challenge was set, and the air in the archery range felt heavier, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Megan stood at the far end of the range, her stance steady, eyes focused on the target ahead. The distance was daunting. 75 yards. For Blake, this was a distance he had mastered. But for Megan, it wasn't just about hitting the target. It was about silencing the doubt that had lived in her for so long. Blake's smug expression never wavered, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. His arrogance had been shaken. He had underestimated Megan, overlooked her for the last time. Now he tried to regain control of the situation, speaking louder than he needed to, as if to drown out the uncertainty creeping into his thoughts. "Well, you've had your luck," Blake said, his voice dripping with false confidence. "But now we're playing on my turf. I'm the champion here, not you." His words hung in the air, but Megan didn't flinch. She barely even heard him. She was used to people like Blake, people who assumed they were above everyone else, who saw others as nothing more than obstacles to be trampled. But Megan knew the truth. People like Blake had their weaknesses. And today, she wasn't going to let his weaknesses get in the way of her own strength. Megan picked up the third arrow, the weight of it familiar in her hand. She adjusted her bowstring and stepped back into her stance, calm, collected, ready. The crowd was silent now, a mixture of awe and anticipation filling the room. They weren't just watching an archery competition anymore, they were watching a battle of wills, a fight between someone who had always been handed victory and someone who had to fight for every inch of progress. As Megan drew back the string, the world around her blurred. She could hear nothing but the rhythm of her breath. Her fingers adjusted, her body locked into place, and she exhaled slowly. The bowstring tugged against her muscles, the tension pulling through her body as she aimed. She could feel Nathan beside her, as though his presence was wrapping around her like a shield, steadying her. She released the arrow. The shot flew through the air with perfect precision, a sharp whisper in the silence of the room. It hit the target with a satisfying thud, the tip embedding itself dead center. The crowd gasped in unison, disbelief evident in their expressions. Even Blake's face faltered for a moment, his jaw tightening as he glanced at the target. There was no mistaking it. Megan had done it. She had made the shot. And now Blake's reputation was on the line. The moment of victory, however, wasn't enough to deter him. He stepped forward, his eyes narrowing, but there was no humor left in his tone. His mask of confidence had slipped, revealing the cracks beneath. "All right," he said, a forced chuckle in his voice, "one shot doesn't make a champion." Megan didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her hands moved like they had done 1,000 times before, a fluid, practiced, controlled. She notched her second arrow with the same calm precision, her focus sharpening as the moment stretched into eternity. Blake was still muttering under his breath, trying to regain his ground, but it was clear now that he was scrambling. He had no control over this. Megan was in her element, and she wasn't going to be intimidated or distracted by his words. She took another breath, her bowstring pulled back, her muscles taut. The room held its collective breath as she let the second arrow fly. It whistled through the air and struck the target with another sharp impact. Bullseye. Again. The crowd erupted into murmurs, some of them starting to realize the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Blake's friends were silent now, exchanging uncertain glances as the realization hit them. This was no longer about an easy bet. This was about something far more profound than they had anticipated. Blake's expression had gone white with fury. He took a step back, looking at the target with growing disbelief, as if trying to make sense of the impossible. Megan, though, remained calm. Her eyes never left the target. This wasn't about showing off. This wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about proving to herself that she still had what it took, proving that her past hadn't been left behind in the graveyard of her grief. Blake tried again, his voice trembling with something close to anger now. You can't, this is just luck. I'm the champion here. Nobody beats me like this. But Megan, for the first time in a long while, wasn't listening to him. The third arrow was in her hand now. It felt heavier somehow, but that wasn't a weakness, it was just a reminder. A reminder of everything she had been through, everything she had fought to overcome. She adjusted her stance once more, drawing the bowstring back, her focus absolute. She didn't need to prove anything to Blake. She didn't even need to prove anything to the crowd. The only person she needed to convince was the woman she had become. The woman who had once lost everything but had found her way back. The third shot flew. The release was smooth, flawless. The arrow hit the target with another resounding thud. And this time it wasn't just a bullseye. It was a statement. It was the sound of everything falling into place. Blake stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and humiliation. His reputation, his money, his entire identity as a champion had been shattered by a woman who had walked in off the street, carrying nothing but her promise and her skill. Megan lowered her bow, her heart racing but her expression calm. She had done it. For a moment, there was silence. Then the crowd erupted into applause. And Blake, once the untouchable champion, stood there, unable to do anything but stare at the target in stunned silence. The silence in the room was deafening, the stillness almost suffocating. Megan stood there, her bow hanging loosely in her hand, the weight of the moment settling around her. The crowd, once filled with whispers and doubtful laughter, had transformed into an audience of stunned witnesses. They had all expected Blake to win, to easily brush aside a woman who didn't even belong in their world. But now, as they stared at the target, 3 perfect bullseyes, they saw something else. Something that no one, not even Blake, could deny. Blake's face had drained of color. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by something darker, frustration, disbelief, and perhaps, for the first time in his life, a touch of fear. Fear of losing. Fear of being exposed. He turned toward the crowd, trying to hide the crack in his facade, but it was too late. His arrogance had already crumbled, and there was no taking it back. He snatched the target from the stand, his hands trembling slightly. The silence in the room felt like it was closing in on him. He studied the bullseye, each arrow perfectly placed, his eyes darting from the target to Megan. The look on his face was a mixture of confusion and anger. This is ridiculous, Blake muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Beginner's luck, that's all this is. There's no way anyone walks in here and does this on their first try. No one. Not even me. Megan's gaze remained steady, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to defend herself. She had already done what she came here to do. But Blake wasn't ready to let it go. His voice rose again, this time laced with venom. You're cheating, aren't you? You must have rigged something. There's no way this is real. Rebecca, who had been quietly observing the spectacle from the side, stepped forward. Her eyes, usually calm, now held a flicker of something sharper. Mr. Hawthorne, you've been outshot. That's all there is to it. You don't have to like it, but you can't deny it. She was trying to defuse the situation, but Blake wasn't listening. Blake's fists clenched at his sides, his temper flaring. He was losing control, and it showed. You think you can just come in here and take everything from me? This is my club. My reputation. I don't lose. His voice was low, seething with anger. Megan, still unmoved by his outburst, took a slow step forward. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but filled with a quiet strength. This isn't about you, Blake. It never was. Her eyes never left his. This is about me keeping a promise to my husband. This is about me proving to myself that I'm still here, still capable. And this is about you learning something you've never understood. Blake's gaze faltered, his bravado weakening with every word she spoke. Megan's calmness in the face of his fury unnerved him. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. For the first time, Blake felt small in a way he hadn't known before. Megan glanced over at the crowd, her eyes sweeping across their faces. The spectators, once so eager to see her fail, now regarded her with a mixture of respect and admiration. She had done what no one had thought possible. She had stepped into the lion's den, not to fight, but to show that even the quietest, most overlooked person could have the strength to stand tall. Blake looked around the room, the weight of his defeat settling in. His reputation, the thing he had clung to for so long, was now slipping away. There was nothing he could do to reclaim it. And Megan? She had already won something far more important. She didn't need the applause, the money, or even the validation. She had already found something much more valuable, her own strength, her own worth. The crowd might have watched her. But in the end, she was the one who had chosen how this story would unfold. Blake finally dropped his gaze, the fight gone from him. Megan didn't wait for him to speak again. She turned toward Rebecca, giving her a small nod of gratitude before gathering her things. She had kept her promise, and that was all that mattered. Days passed, but the events of the archery challenge lingered in the air, hanging over both Megan and Blake like an unspoken truth. Megan, despite the victory, remained quiet. The victory, though sweet, hadn't been about the applause or the shock she'd caused. It had been about reclaiming herself, her strength, her resilience, and her purpose. But the quiet reverence that followed her wasn't what she had expected. She had walked away not with grand celebrations, but with a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. Her phone buzzed late one night, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Rebecca. "I know you're not in this for the spotlight, but I need you to hear this. Blake has requested to match up in a real competition. He wants to settle this once and for all." Megan stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the screen. She didn't want to dive back into this world of competition, of proving herself. She had already done that. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that Blake wasn't done with her. His pride had been shattered, and now he wanted retribution. The next day, she received an official invitation from the elite archery club, a formal competition. Her heart sank as she read the details. The stakes were higher this time. The terms of the challenge were clear. Blake wanted this to be public. The whole city would watch, and Megan knew it wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about facing the truth of who she had become and standing firm in that. As the invitation lay on her desk, Megan's mind flashed back to Nathan's words. "Keep practicing, Megan. Don't let the world tell you who you are." This wasn't about the money or the glory. This was about standing her ground once and for all. The day of the competition arrived, and the elite archery club buzzed with excitement. The room was packed with spectators, the air electric with anticipation. Blake stood at one end of the range, confident as ever. His supporters gathered around him. Megan stood at the opposite end, calm and focused. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade as she took her position. She wasn't here for revenge or glory. She was here to prove something much deeper to herself. Blake, sensing the gravity of the moment, shot her a challenging look. His arrogance was gone, replaced by an unsettling sense of urgency. He wanted to win, not just for the title but to reclaim the pride he had lost. The first few rounds passed in a blur of arrows flying through the air. Blake's technique was flawless, his shots sharp and precise, but Megan's quiet determination, her steady hand, and unshakable focus were what set her apart. With each round, the distance between them shrank. The score was nearly tied. The tension in the room thickened, each arrow striking the target louder than the last. As the final round approached, Blake tightened his grip on his bow, his eyes narrowing. He couldn't lose again. Not like this. Megan, however, felt a quiet strength building inside her. She wasn't afraid. She knew what this moment meant, not just for her, but for the legacy of the man who had taught her how to shoot, how to stand firm in the face of everything that tried to break her. With a steady breath, she released her final arrow. It flew through the air, hitting the bullseye once more. The room erupted in applause. Megan had won, not just the competition, but a victory over everything that had held her back. Blake stood there, frozen, his pride now irreparably shattered. If you were inspired by Megan's journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and strength. Thank you for watching.